Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this very interesting conference. And certainly, I mean, I'm going to talk a bit about what some might think as the usual suspect, right, and how COVID might have or not affected, voter turnout and electoral participation. In fact, when we look into history, go back some century ago and look at the U.S. Elections, presidential elections that took place during the second wave of the Spanish, well, so-called Spanish flu, even if it was not coming from Spain, in November 1918. You see on the right side the graph that compares, voter turnout on those elections with previous elections, and we see that on the 5th of November 1918. The voter turnout was quite low. In fact, it was lower than 40%. It was 10.5 points lower than in the previous midterm elections in 1914. It was, in fact, the lowest voter turnout level in U.S. history of midterm elections since 1798. So some, of course, with less data than we have today, thought that, the Spanish flu had, influence, the low level of turnout at those elections. And the same can be seen, when we look at the 1920 presidential elections. Once again, it's 10.6 points lower than in the previous presidential elections of 1916, and it was, in fact, one of the presidential elections with lowest turnout. In fact, since 1824, hadn't seen such a low level of turnout. The picture, however, and contrary to what some would expect, changes 1 century later. We see that the 2020 presidential elections that took place in the United States in November were, in fact, one of the highest in terms of levels of turnout, reaching almost, 70%. So the question that comes from this is, well, we might expect, and we will see, in the review of the theories, that certainly, COVID should have affected, the level of turnout in United States presidential elections. However, let's say a wider comparison, once again, between the Spanish flu and the COVID-19, show us that in reality the picture is once again not that clear. You see here in this graph, all parliamentary elections that took place after the Spanish flu all over the world, democratic countries, of course. And we clearly see that once, even if, the average level of turnout after, the Spanish flu was 3 points higher than before, the truth is that when we split the sample between those countries where turnout increased and those where turnout decreased, the truth is that, in 10 out of 17, turnout and decrease rather than increase. When we look at COVID, we see a very similar picture, and we see that in 14 countries all over the world, the level of turnout decreased after COVID, but in a huge number of countries too, 12, increase. So once again, we see that there is a mixed picture. What does the theory tell us? Well, since Down's seminal study, voter turnout has been one of the phenomenon that has been most studied, in the history of political science. And there are, of course, those theories that try to explain higher or lower levels of turnout from the point of view of the benefits and the costs of voting. Of course, there are those scholars that point how external shocks have an impact on voter turnout by increasing or reducing the benefits and costs of voting. In fact, for example, from the point of view of the benefits, we could call it, school of thought, there is this idea that, external shocks might constitute a mobilizing effect. The idea is that, they really put, elections as, very important and, are a kind of civic duty. So this is the idea that, external shocks force somehow, voters to go to the polls. There are, however, those who think that, well, in reality, external shocks, what do is they increase the cost of voting because, they tend to reduce individuals, economic resources and therefore, decrease their willingness to turn to vote. Perhaps the literature that is closer to this question, this research question about the effects of COVID-19 on electoral participation, is the literature that looks at, external shocks. And the two main external shocks that the scholars have studied is, on the one hand, the terrorist attacks, and on the other hand, natural disasters. And interestingly enough, they are also talking to these different, schools or trends that I was talking, just a minute ago about the benefits and the cost of voting. In fact, terrorist attacks tend to look at this, school of thought of the benefits of voting. And for example, the works that have studied the bombings that took place in my country in 2004 in Madrid, for example, Lago and Montero, but also Bali, have shown that, the bombings, the terrorist attack increased turnout in up to 5 points, mobilizing especially those who were, less willing, traditionally to participate. The other, let's say, trend, which is natural disasters, talks more to the cost of voting. And in fact, for example, studies that have looked into the 2005, Hurricane Katrina effect on voter turnout, but also on the 1989, Loma Prieta earthquake in California, or even those that have looked at floods in Germany in 2002 in Saxony or 2013 in Bavaria, show how these external shocks, these natural disasters, they tend to decrease the willingness of voters to turn out and vote, decreasing the average level of turnout. The picture still here is a bit mixed because, there have been other studies that have tried to look at, for example, the effect of Caribbean hurricanes or, the Calgary floods in 2013 or the Pakistan floods also in the 2010-2011. And they found out that there is no effect, there is no relationship between, these external shocks and the level of turnout. Perhaps even closer to our research question is the literature that looks at, health and especially how health problems have affected, electoral participation. For example, the study of Matila and other authors in 2013 shows how health problems tend to reduce the willingness of voters to turn out to vote. Similarly, Landfar and Ojeda in 2020, they have a very interesting, study that looks at depression and how, for example, depression tends to also decrease the levels of turnout and the willingness of individuals to go out of home and participate. Closer again is the study, for example, of Haute and co-authors on the French 2020 local elections, or Constantino and co-authors 2021 on the Brazil local elections. They show how fear of contagion reduced the level of turnout in those elections. When we look at specific works that look at the COVID-19 effect on electoral participation, which, by the way, tend to take place in either case studies or, subnational, elections, and till now there is not a proper, let's say, comparative large chain study like the one that I'm presenting here to you today. We see that once again the picture is mixed. There are all those studies that have looked at the effect of the US elections. Some say that, the COVID-19 helped to increase the level of participation. Others say that no, and there were other issues, like, for example, ideological and political polarization. However, when we look at, for example, local studies that have been looking at local elections in Brazil, in Italy, France, and also in my own country, there is a very interesting study that looks at the effect of COVID in the Basque regional election. The picture tends to go on the side of a negative effect, in the sense that, COVID-19 reduced the willingness of individuals to turn out and vote, and of course, decrease the level of turnout at the aggregate level. For that reason, in this study, we formulate two main hypotheses. The first one is looking at the effect of COVID operationalized as the number of deaths. So the higher the number of deaths in a polity, the lower the level of turnout. And the second one, looks at number of infections. So the higher the number of infections in a polity, the lower the electoral turnout. We also try to look at the literature on type of elections, the idea that, second-order elections, people tend to vote less. I will not go, for the sake of time, into that, but we formulate a third hypothesis that basically looks at the effects of deaths and infections in relation to the type of election. So we formulate the hypothesis in the following way. The effects of deaths and infections on turnout will be larger in regional than national elections. In terms of data and methodology, well, we collected data for all democratic polities, 36 countries and 19 regions in the world. We exclude Catalonia. Catalonia is, a clear outlier in the whole, sample, because it has twice the deaths per million that any other polity, because it has is one of the largest in the number of infections, and of course, in the level of turnout is the third largest. So clearly, the Catalonian elections, there was something going on. I could talk years and years about this, the independence movement, the polarization, etc., etc. So we exclude Catalonia from the sample for the reasons that I have just pointed out. This leaves us with 54 polities. We look at, as you can see, parliamentary elections, presidential elections. We include, of course, the Polish presidential elections of June 2020, and regional elections in different countries. So basically all elections that took place between the moment that the pandemic started to affect elections around March 2020. So we start with Guyana and Israel, and we finish 1 year later with the parliamentary elections in El Salvador of February 2021. So at the end, we have these 54 democratic polities. Our dependent variable is turnout in post-COVID elections minus average turnout in previous pre-COVID 3 elections. We use 3 elections because this is has been used in previous studies as a landmark to make the comparison. Still, we have run the same models with the previous election, 2 elections, 3 elections, and the results do not change. Our main independent variables are, as you can imagine, the number of infections and the number of deaths per million. Of course, we control for voting provisions. So, for example, for the number of voting provisions, if there was a possibility of early voting, postal voting, proxy voting, mobile voting, and other specific COVID-19 provisions. As the literature shows, compulsory voting may have an effect, of course, in level of turnout, so we control for that. And taking into consideration that, as the pandemic goes, there will be more, people will get more accustomed, to the different provisions, to the participation in elections, they will feel more secure, there will be, mask and other measurements, social distance that will help people to feel secure. We also control for time with a variable that looks at the number of days in the beginning of the period study and is log that variable. We use OLS regression analysis. We also do some robustness checks with bootstrapped interactions, mixed multi-level fixed effects models. I will not show those robustness checks because at the end of the day, they just simply confirm the results that I'm going to show you right now. So regarding the first hypothesis that basically try to look at, the effect of the number of deaths on the level of turnout, we see here that the sign is as expected, negative, although, the effect is very, very, very small and is not significant. The same for hypothesis 2, we have this negative effect, but is extremely small and once again is not significant. Interestingly enough, all the control variables have the expected sign, but are not significant. Regarding hypothesis 3, we see that looking at regional or presidential or second order elections and looking at national elections that not really have any influence. We use an interaction effect in this first regression in the pool sample. We also look at the split of the sample into the national and the regional subsample. You see that the results remain the same. Yes, is a negative effect, but very small and non-significant. Once again, all the control variables have the expected sign, but is not significant. So the conclusions that we can get from this brief, I would say seminal in terms that I haven't seen such a large comparison so far on the relationship between COVID-19 and electoral participation. Well, COVID-19 has affected us a lot in terms of restrictions, in terms of not being able to fly, in terms of not being able to have a coffee with you today after the conference finishes. But in terms of turnout, the truth is that, like in Sherlock Holmes stories, the dog failed to bark, meaning that COVID-19 didn't have any real significant effect on the levels of electoral participation and voter turnout. In some cases, like in Poland during the presidential elections or the United States presidential elections, there were other clearly, factors like political polarization that led to increased levels of turnouts. In other countries, people decided to stay home and be safe. But there is not a general inference that we can take from the effect of COVID on electoral participation. So I'm sorry to say that sometimes we don't get papers published because the results are not significant. But in my view, the results here, the fact that they're not significant, are extremely surprising, and this is the interesting part of the paper. Thank you very, very much for your attention, and looking forward to the discussion and the Q&A.